Hey guys, welcome back to more Karen neighbor stories. In this video, a ridiculous neighbor built pool houses on my private property claiming it is abandoned land. Here is what happened. Let's dive right into the story. When I first purchased my land, it was a decent-sized plot in a rural-ish area. The property had been in rough shape when I got it, overgrown with weeds and scattered with old junk from the previous owner. The main house sat on the front portion, but the property actually extended quite a bit further back than most people realized. There was this weird finger of land that jutted out behind my house and ran alongside what would eventually become my neighbor's property. It was separated by some old trees and dense brush, almost a small forest, so unless you actually walk the property lines with the survey documents, you wouldn't necessarily know it was all one parcel. I spent the first few years focused on fixing up the main house and the immediate yard area. The back portion, that finger of land, basically just sat there. I would occasionally walk back there, but mostly it was just untouched. I knew I owned it, I had the deed, I had the survey. I had the property tax bills that clearly showed the entire acreage, but I was not in any rush to develop it. And then, about 3 years into owning my place, a guy moved in next door. Let's call him neighbor, because honestly, he doesn't deserve the dignity of a name after what he pulled. Neighbor seemed fine at first, we would wave occasionally, make small talk about the weather a few times, nothing special, but nothing hostile either. He had bought the property next to mine and started making improvements pretty quickly. The problem started gradually. I began noticing that neighbor was spending a lot of time near the back portion of his property, right up against where that finger of land from my property ran. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people walk their property, right? No big deal. But then I started noticing construction equipment back there. Again, I figured he was doing something on his own land, not my business. I was busy with my own projects and honestly didn't pay that much attention to what was happening beyond my immediate view. And yeah, sometimes I heard construction noise coming from there, but I didn't really pay attention to it because in my mind, that must have happened on my neighbor's property, and I did not really spend any time on that side of my property since, as I said before, it's a small forest almost, and I'm not a nature person. Additionally, what I didn't mention before is why I was so distracted during that time, why I wasn't paying attention to anything happening on the back portion of my property. The truth is, my world had fallen apart in a way that made property lines and construction noise seem completely insignificant. So I got a call from my ex-wife, Sarah. We'd been divorced for 5 years, but we had managed to stay on good terms. No kids, but we had built a friendship out of what was left after the marriage ended. She was calling to tell me that she had cancer. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind that does not leave much room for hope. And Sarah did not have anyone else. Her parents had passed years ago, she was an only child, and the guy she'd been dating had apparently vanished the moment he heard the word cancer. When she asked if I could help her through the treatments, I did not even hesitate. Whatever had ended our marriage, she didn't deserve to face this alone. I spent the next 13 months living in her apartment across town, taking her to chemotherapy appointments, holding her hand through the worst of it. I watched this vibrant, stubborn, beautiful person, the woman I had once promised forever, to slowly disappear. The cancer was aggressive and the treatments were brutal. There were days she couldn't get out of bed, nights where she would wake up crying from the pain. Moments where she would look at me with these hollow eyes and apologize for being a burden, and I would have to choke back my own tears and tell her she could never be a burden. The house, my property, all of it became background noise. I'd come back once every week or two to grab clothes, check the mail, make sure everything was still standing. I would be there for maybe an hour before rushing back to Sarah. I was not thinking about property lines or neighbors or anything else. I was thinking about making sure Sarah had her medications, that she was eating something, anything, and that she knew she was not alone. Towards the end, she was in hospice care at the apartment. I slept on the couch, waking up every few hours to check on her. We talked about everything and nothing. She told me she was sorry that our marriage had not worked out, and I told her I wasn't, because it meant that we got to be here for each other now in this different way. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, with me holding her hand exactly 1 year and 17 days after her diagnosis. The grief was crushing. I took another month before I could even think about going back to my normal life. When I finally returned to my property full-time, I was running on autopilot. The house felt empty. Everything felt empty. I was just going through the motions of living, trying to figure out how to exist in a world where Sarah wasn't. That's why I did not notice. So yeah, it was not until about a year later that I actually walked back to that portion of my property and got the shock of my life. There were 2 houses with fancy pools, I guess you could call them pool villas, 2 entire structures complete with roofs, walls, doors, windows, the works. They were sitting right there on my land, clear as day. And beyond them I could see that neighbor had cleared a bunch of the area and put in a large in-ground pool on his own actual property, and I stood there for a solid 5 minutes just staring, trying to process what I was seeing. These were legitimate buildings with electricity running to them. Someone had put serious money into these things. I walked back to my house, grabbed my property survey documents and walked the whole area again with the papers in hand. There was absolutely no question. Both pool houses were entirely on my property, at least 15 feet over the property line. This was not some case of someone accidentally building a fence 2 inches over. This was a massive, deliberate encroachment. The next day, I went over to the neighbor's house to have what I assumed would be an awkward but ultimately fixable conversation. I knocked on his door, survey documents in hand, ready to politely point out the mistake and figure out a solution. That's when I discovered that neighbor was not the reasonable type. He answered the door with this smug look on his face, like he had been expecting me. Before he could even finish explaining what I had found, he cut me off saying, "Yeah, those pool houses. What about them?" I explained that they were on my property, that I had the survey right here and that we needed to figure out how to resolve this situation. That's when he laughed, actually laughed in my face. He told me that the land was abandoned, that I clearly didn't want it or use it, and that he'd effectively annexed it through adverse possession. He claimed he had been openly using it for over a year already, that I'd done nothing about it, and that by the time any legal process played out, he would have met the requirements to claim it legally. I tried to explain that adverse possession doesn't work that way, that it requires many years of continuous use and meeting specific legal requirements, not just building on someone's land and hoping they don't notice. He waved his hand dismissively though and said that I could try to fight it if I wanted, but I would just be wasting my money. Then he dropped the real bomb. He told me that if I pursued this, he would make my life hell. He would file countersuits, claim I'd given him permission, drag the process out for years and cost me tens of thousands in legal fees. He finished by basically daring me to try to take the land back, saying that the law was on his side and I should just accept that the land was his now. I stood there on his porch, absolutely stunned. This was not someone who had made an honest mistake. This was someone who deliberately built on my property, knew exactly what he was doing, and was banking on me being too intimidated or too broke to fight back. I went home, spent the next week doing research. I contacted a property attorney, explained the situation to him, and brought all my documentation. The attorney looked over everything and confirmed what I already knew. The land was mine, clear title, no ambiguity whatsoever. The adverse possession claim was nonsense. You cannot just build on someone's property for a year and claim it as yours. In my state, adverse possession requires continuous, open and hostile use for at least 10 years, among other requirements, and the neighbor did not have a leg to stand on. So the attorney laid out my options. I could send a formal demand letter, file for a court order to have the structures removed and potentially sue for damages and the cost of removal. But here's where it got interesting. The attorney asked if neighbor had pulled any building permits for these pool houses, and I hadn't even thought about that. We called the county building department and sure enough, there were no permits on file for any structures on neighbor's property in the past 2 years. He had built 2 entire buildings without permits, without inspections, without any of the legal requirements you need to follow when constructing permanent structures. That is when my attorney smiled and told me this could get very expensive for the neighbor. But I wanted to be absolutely sure before I started anything, so I had a professional surveyor come out and mark the exact property lines. The surveyor confirmed everything. Both pool houses were entirely on my property, and the survey was filed with the county with photographs and GPS coordinates. Armed with all this, my attorney sent the neighbor a formal letter. It laid out the facts, included copies of the survey, photographs, and my deed. It demanded that he remove both structures within 30 days and restore the land to its original condition. It also informed him that his adverse possession claim had no legal merit and that building without permits was a violation of county code. I honestly thought it might be the end of it. Faced with undeniable proof and the threat of county code enforcement, surely he would back down. Instead though, I got a response from his attorney 2 weeks later, and it was the most ridiculous legal document I'd ever seen. It claimed that I'd verbally given the neighbor permission to use the land, that I'd abandoned it, and that the structures were actually on his property, and my survey was supposedly wrong, and that he was filing a counterclaim for harassment and to quiet title in his favor. He also dared me to fight him on this since he was sure that he was in the right. My attorney read it and actually laughed. He said it was one of the weakest responses he had ever seen, but it meant we were going to court. This is where the malicious compliance comes in. Remember how neighbor had dared me to try to take the land back? How he had smugly told me I should just accept the situation and move on? Well, I was gonna comply with his dare, but not in the way he expected. We filed our lawsuit seeking removal of the structures, damages, legal fees, and an injunction preventing any further encroachment. But we also did something else. We filed a formal complaint with the county code enforcement office about the unpermitted structures. Now, here's the thing about code enforcement. Once they get a complaint with photographic evidence and a survey showing structures built without permits, they gotta investigate, and once they investigate and confirm the violation, they have to act. Within 2 weeks of filing the complaint, neighbor had a county inspector at his door. The inspector confirmed the violations, issued citations, and gave the neighbor 30 days to either get the structures permitted retroactively or remove them. Neighbor apparently tried to get permits after the fact, but here's where he ran into a massive problem. So the structures were on my property, not his. The county won't issue building permits for structures on land that you don't own. Neighbor tried to argue that he was claiming the land through adverse possession, but the county explained that until he had a court judgment giving him title to the land, they could not issue permits. So now my neighbor was stuck. He couldn't get permits. Further, he could not legally keep the structures, and the county was fining him for every day the unpermitted structures remained standing. The fine started at $100 per day per structure. $200 a day adds up real fast. While this was happening, our court case was moving forward. We had our hearing dates set and my attorney filed motions for summary judgment, arguing that the facts were so clear that there was no need for a full trial. Neighbor's attorney tried to fight it, but his arguments were falling apart. He could not produce any evidence of permission because there wasn't any. He couldn't prove adverse possession because the time requirements were just not met. He could not even argue the survey was wrong because we had GPS coordinates and of course also professional certification. About 2 months into this mess, I got a call from the neighbor directly, which my attorney had advised me to expect. He was much less cocky this time. He offered to remove the structures if I dropped the lawsuit and agree not to pursue damages or legal fees. My attorney's advice was simple. No, neighbor had chosen this path. He had been arrogant, threatening, and had dared me to fight him. Now he was going to pay the full cost of his decisions. We went to the hearing, and it was almost anticlimactic. The judge reviewed the evidence, asked neighbor's attorney if he had any actual proof of permission or ownership, and when the attorney couldn't provide any, the judge ruled in my favor on the spot. The judge's order was comprehensive. Neighbor had to remove both structures within 30 days, and he had to restore the land to its original condition. He had to pay me damages for the loss of use of my property during the time the structures were there, and here's the big one, he had to pay my attorney fees, which by this point had reached nearly $20,000. The county code enforcement violations were separate from the civil case, so neighbor also had to pay all the accumulated fines to the county by the time the court case concluded. I thought that would be the end of it actually. The court had ruled the order was clear. Neighbor had 30 days to comply, but then things took a dark turn. About 3 weeks after the court ruling, I was out in my yard when I heard machinery running behind the property. I walked back to check on the progress of the removal, expecting to see a crew taking down the structures, but instead I found my neighbor himself alone with a handgun tucked into his waistband. He was standing next to the pool houses, not removing them, but actually reinforcing them. When he saw me, his whole demeanor changed. He pulled the gun out and pointed it in my direction. He started yelling that he had put too much money into this project to let some piece of paper tell him what to do. He said the land was his, that he had fought the law and he was gonna keep fighting, and that I needed to get off what he called his property before something bad happened. I'm not a brave person, I'm not confrontational by nature, but standing there with a gun being waved in my general direction, something in my brain just went ice cold analytical. I didn't argue, I didn't try to reason with him, I just slowly backed away, kept my hands visible and walked back to my house. The second I was inside, I called the police and told them exactly what had happened. A man had threatened me with a gun on my own property while actively violating a court order. The response was fast. Not long after, I had 3 police cars in my driveway. I showed them the court order, explained the situation, and led them back to where neighbor was still working on these structures. When neighbor saw the police coming, he apparently decided that doubling down was the right move. He did not put the gun down when ordered. He started arguing with the officers about property rights and court corruption and how the system was apparently rigged against him. That is when things escalated. The officers drew their weapons, ordered the neighbor to drop the gun and get on the ground. For a few very tense moments, I genuinely thought someone was gonna get shot, but eventually, the neighbor seemed to realize the position he had put himself in and complied. They arrested him on the spot for brandishing a weapon, making terroristic threats and violating the court order, and they also found out that the neighbor didn't have a valid permit to carry a concealed weapon, which added another charge. As they were loading him into the police car, one of the officers told me that I would need to file a report and possibly testify. I said I would do whatever was necessary. The aftermath unfolded over the next several months. Neighbor was held on bail, which was set pretty high given the weapon charges. His wife posted it and he was released pending trial on the criminal charges. With neighbor facing criminal charges, he apparently decided to cut his losses on the civil matter. His attorney contacted my attorney and offered to comply with everything. They hired a professional crew to remove both pool houses and restore the land. They paid all the damages, legal fees, and county fines. I honestly thought it might satisfy me, but my attorney pointed out that we could also file a restraining order given the threats and the gun incident. We did, and it was granted. Neighbor was now legally prohibited from coming within 100 feet of me or my property. The criminal trial took a while to work through the system, but eventually, neighbor took a plea deal. He pled guilty to the weapon charges and the menacing charge. The terroristic threats charge was dropped as part of the deal, but he still ended up with a few months in county jail, followed by probation. I heard his wife filed for divorce not long after he went to jail. The house went up for sale within a few months, and I'm not sure of all the legal details of how that worked with him being locked up, but apparently she had power of attorney or something. Either way though, she was gone before he got out. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the whole situation had destroyed them financially. Between the legal fees, the fines, the cost of removing the structures, my damages, and his wife's attorney fees for the divorce, they had lost essentially everything. The property next door sat empty for a while before being sold at a loss to a nice young couple with kids who have been great neighbors. As for me, I finally developed that back portion of my property. I put up a proper fence along the property line, cleared out some of the brush, and turned it into a nice little walking trail with a small garden area at the back. Sometimes I sit back there with a cup of coffee and think about the absurdity of the whole situation. Neighbor had dared me to fight him, confident that I'd back down or that he could outlast me in court. He thought he could bully me into accepting his theft of my land. And well, instead, his arrogance and his refusal to back down when confronted with clear evidence ended up costing him his freedom, his marriage, his home, and his financial security. As for me, I'm just glad it's over. I have my land back, I have good neighbors now, and I have one hell of a story about what happens when someone dares you to stand up for yourself and you actually do it. The moral, if there's one, is simple: be careful what you dare someone to do. They might just comply and you might not like the results. And the next one is a super high-rated malicious compliance story, which is titled "Ex-Husband Ghosts Ex-Wife and Racks Up a Huge Bill." He clearly didn't think things through. I'm working in the billing queue in a call center for one of the big 3 telcos, and a client calls in regarding a billing concern. So this lady calls in and is puzzled by why she got charged a one-time fee, $49, for a wireless access point. It is Gen 1 equipment for wireless set-top box for Optic TV, and she's even more puzzled why she would have that charge when she doesn't have TV services from us. And I inform she does. It started more or less a month ago. She's disputing that because Optic TV is not available in her area, but now I'm confused. She lives in a small town and there's no Optic TV there. I do a little digging and find out that someone, not ex-husband, was still on her account and got 3-year contract to get a free TV for Optic TV and internet. She begins to cry on the phone and tells me her now ex-husband had an affair with a younger woman, divorced her, milked her for as much as he could, and apparently still is milking her for more. He basically totally ghosted her, moved to Alberta, changed his email, phone number, and blocked her on all social media, etc. In my mind, I'm like, what a dickhead, and I'm like, well, I'm sorry if you cancel the services, you're on the hook to pay for cancellation fees and so on. I can tell her though I can remove his access to your account, and you can also add on a password, downgrade the internet and TV to the bare essentials, and I can attempt to redirect the TV gift from his address to hers, but there's no guarantee as it's been processed already. I can hear the light going off in her head. Wait, what? You have where he's living at now? Why, yes. He's got TV and internet services, so there's a service address. She then goes really quiet and says her lawyer and herself have been trying to track him down, but his family and friends are being light-tipped about it. She asks if I'm allowed to give that info to her. I smile and reply, "This is your account. You have unrestricted access for service address, phone number, emails that your now ex-husband provided to us to get hooked up." She asks that I can give her his new address, his new cell number, and the second number left on the account, presumably the new woman, and contact info over the phone right now. I asked if she had a pen and paper handy, and she was so ecstatic. And after giving her all the details from her account regarding the second service address, downgrade everything, and he was a hockey fan and there was a game playing right now with his team, so I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when the game cuts out and he calls in to ask, "What the F?" and discovered that he's been removed and there's an account pin and he's been discovered by his ex-wife and lawyer. Before we end the video, let's read another fantastic malicious compliance story that is brand new. This one is titled "No Heat for You." So back when I was a field tech, one of my customers was a tall office building. Purchasing was often super stingy, approving maintenance and custodial quotes, it was always a fight. There was some repair work being done on the HVAC, heating and cooling system, and one of the maintenance personnel asked the contractors to add a couple of extra shut-off valves leading to the executive floor. Whenever purchasing would deny an HVAC maintenance request, one of the support staff would go into a crawl way and throttle the ball valve to the executive loop back by about 60%. So this would restrict the flow just enough to make the executive floor too cold or too hot. When one of the bigwigs would complain, maintenance would just reply with, "Well, we need a new bearing assembly, or whatever. We put a quote in last week and we are just waiting for purchasing to approve it, but I'll see what I can do today." And then an hour or so later, the quote would be approved, and a few hours after that, the valve would be opened back to almost full, then opened completely when the new whatever arrived. And yeah guys, thank you so much for watching. If you're on mobile, please don't forget to hype the video because that would help me tremendously. I will see you again tomorrow.